Hello, everyone. Welcome to the City of Laguna Niguel's Veteran Day Ceremony. I am Mayor Kelly Jennings, and I will be your guide throughout today's program. We are thankful to have you join us to honor our brave veterans. We will begin today's ceremony with a presentation of flags led by Boy Scout Troop 772. The arrival of the flags will immediately be followed by Councilmember Jean Johns leading us in the Pledge of Allegiance. And finally, we will hear the national anthem performed by Orange County Sheriff's Department Deputy Joe Davila of the Laguna Niguel Police Unit. At this time, I ask you to please stand and remain standing as we honor our flag to this great country.
Audience attention. Color guard, attention. Color guard, advance. Color guard, prepare to post the colors. Scouts and those in the military, please salute. And those not in uniform, place your right hand over your heart.
To show our appreciation and commitment to patriotism, please join me as we pay our respects by pledging allegiance to our nation's flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Two, color guard, post the colors. Color guard, regroup. Color guard dismissed. Audience at ease. Thank you.
You can remain standing. And thank you to all my veterans out there. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deputy Davila, for the beautiful rendition of our nation's anthem. Before we move any further in today's program, I would like for us to share in a moment of silence to show our respect to those who gave the ultimate sacrifice during their service to this great country. To lead us in a moment of silence, I invite retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel, the third Vice Commander of the South Orange County American Legion Post 281, Shep Bentley, to the stage.
For all who are joining us today to commemorate the service and sacrifices of those in defense of our freedom, for whom the bell tolls. Thank you. You may be seated.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Shep Bentley. Thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to acknowledge some of the elected officials who are here joining us today, along with a special group of people who work hard to serve our community. When I say your name, please stand so that we can recognize you. Joining us today, we have Mayor Pro Tem Stephanie Otto, Councilmember Ray Genoway, Councilmember Jean Johns, Councilmember Stephanie Winstead, and Assistant City Manager Justin Martin. Additionally, we have representatives from the Office of Orange County State Assemblywoman Lori Davies. We'll clap for her anyway. California State Senator Kathleen Blakespear. And Orange County 5th District Supervisor Katrina Foley's office. I would also like to ask all of the members of the Laguna Niguel Military Support Committee, the American Legion Post, and the American Legion Auxiliary to please rise so you can be acknowledged. And of course, in the great city of Laguna Niguel, we are extremely thankful to all of our hometown veterans, and I'm so happy that we have so many joining us today. We will be recognizing them, each veteran in attendance individually, later in this morning's program. As the mayor of Laguna Niguel, I am truly honored and humbled to be here to pay tribute to our veterans and their families. A veteran is a true American hero that has unselfishly placed their life on the line for our freedoms, and we can never repay them for that. Veterans Day is a very special day, a day that honors all those who have served and currently serve in the United States military. As we gather here today, it's important to remember that there are countless members of our armed forces that are stationed at all corners of the world, all in an effort to protect this great country. They are missed by their families, friends, and loved ones here and back home. As a community, we can show our gratitude by reaching out and expressing our appreciation, and by recognizing the impact that military service has had on all of our lives, which has led to the protection and freedoms of what we so cherish each and every day. Today, this Veterans Day, we come together as a community to say thank you to all veterans and their families for their service and for their sacrifices. At this time, I'd like to welcome Mayor Pro Tem Stephanie Otto, who is the City Council's co-liaison to the Laguna Niguel Military Support Committee, to share the important history of Veterans Day with all of us. After all, we cannot truly honor our veterans without first knowing about the history of Veterans Day.
Thank you so much, Mayor Jennings. I'd like to call Lucky Walsh to come give the invocation, please.
Good morning, everybody. I would like you all to stand, please. If you're covered, remove your cover. If you're not, put your hand over your chest, over your heart. Oh God, our Heavenly Father, you have blessed us with brave men and women who are willing to defend our freedom. May your protection and grace surround them each day. Let your healing hand be upon those who suffer wounds and injuries. Many those who have made the ultimate sacrifice rest forever in your holy presence. Comfort the families who mourn and are left to remember the precious lives of their loved ones. Help us to honor and support them. Let us ever be mindful of each sacrifice made on behalf of the American people by our sons, our daughters, our husbands, our wives, our mothers, our fathers, and our friends. Amen.
Thank you so much, Lucky, for that beautiful prayer. So, good morning. Thank you so much for being here today. In Laguna Niguel, we observe Veterans Day as a tribute to our citizens who made the honorable decision to defend this great nation and its way of life by serving in the United States Armed Forces. I'm honored to share that tradition with so many American families, as my father served in the United States Army in Germany during the Vietnam era. It's so important to teach our younger generations about the history and significance of Veterans Day so that its tradition is carried on well into the future. We do this work through the city's Military Support Committee, the Youth Committee, and through various other community partners like the American Legion and the Legion's Women's Auxiliary. In the United States, Veterans Day is observed on November 11th each year. The significance of this date is meant to honor the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, which signaled the end of World War I on November 11th, 1918. This date was originally known as Armistice Day. However, in 1954, after World War II and the Korean War ended, President Eisenhower officially changed the name of the holiday to Armistice Day, from Armistice Day to what we now know as Veterans Day. 14 years later, in 1968, Congress passed the Uniform Holidays Bill, which moved Veterans Day to the fourth Monday in October. The law went into effect in 1971, but in 1975, President Gerald Ford signed a new law which returned the annual observance of Veterans Day to the original date of November 11th, due to the meaningful historical significance. The restoration of the observance of Veterans Day to November 11th not only preserved the historical significance of the date, but it also helped focus attention on the important purpose of the day, which is to celebrate and honor our brave veterans for their patriotism, love of country, and willingness to serve and sacrifice for the common good. November 11th commemorates all who have served and are currently serving in the United States Armed Forces. I thank the Laguna Niguel community for coming together on this Veterans Day and for your ongoing support of all veterans. Now I'd like to welcome my council colleague and fellow co-liaison to the Military Support Committee, Council Member Stephanie Winstead, to the podium to share with us a little bit about our special guest speaker.
Thank you so much, Mayor Pro Tem Otto, and thank you all for being here today. It is important that the sacrifices made by our brave servicemen and women do not go unappreciated, and they are never forgotten. Without these sacrifices, our freedoms would not be what they are today. In Laguna Niguel, it is our long-standing tradition to celebrate Veterans Day by sharing the story of our veterans. It is my honor to introduce and welcome today's very special guest speaker. We are fortunate to have retired Major, U.S. Army Infantry, Hammond Mackey Sally, with us today to recount his memories while serving for the U.S. Army. Major Sally attended the University of Florida, where he received an Army ROTC commission in the infantry. During the next 21 years, he served in assignments throughout the United States, 2 tours in Germany during the Cold War, and 2 tours in Vietnam. Hammond has served in armored, airborne, and mechanized infantry divisions, as well as the special operations units. He is airborne, ranger, and special forces qualified. In 1967, he was the assistant operations officer of both the 6th PSYOP Battalion and the 4th PSYOP Group, and was in Saigon when the Tet Offensive commenced in January 1968. Then, as a member of a top-secret Black Operations Unit, Hammond was sent to Forward Operations Base 3 at the Khe Sanh Combat Base during the 77-day siege of Khe Sanh. Major Sally is one of the very few Army officers privileged to have been awarded a Navy Presidential Unit citation for his association with the 26th Marines during this historic battle, which his organization received for their substantial contribution to the success of American forces in holding off the massive North Vietnamese force in the siege of Khe Sanh. His topic today is focused on the siege of Khe Sanh, a personal account. We're so fortunate to have him with us here today to share his story. So without much further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming retired U.S. Army General Hammond Mackie Sally.
Well, thank you, Councilmember Winstead, and I appreciate the promotion to General. I just don't get the pay that goes with it. However, it is indeed a privilege to be here in observance of Veterans Day, and I really appreciate the honor of being asked. And I want to thank all for attending, and especially all the veterans that are in the audience. Today, as indicated, I will be sharing some of my personal experiences as they occurred during the 77-day siege of Khe Sanh in 1968 in Vietnam. I'm here under the auspices, basically, of the Freedom Committee of Orange County. I won't go down the slide, but I will say the mission of the Freedom Committee is to bring living history into the classrooms of Orange County schools, and we've been very successful at it. However, for the schools, we generally put together a structured presentation, which will be a school presentation. And part of the structure is you start with your early life, what you did in the military, and maybe a little bit of what you did after you left the military. Next slide, please. I'm a very proud Army brat. My dad, Colonel Henry M. Sally, spent 30 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. In World War II, he left for Germany and out of New York City on a tramp ship on July 1942, wound up in England, and commanded all engineer troops in the 8th District. And he was responsible for building all the airfields for the 8th and 9th Army airfields in England, and he came home in September of 1945. He was also responsible for a couple of the construction of several of the artificial harbors, or Phoenix units, that were used after the invasion of D-Day to offload all the ships and all the supplies that came in to support the invasion. And finally, he was also responsible, he didn't want it, but he was stuck with it, for the storage and issue all the top secret maps to issue to the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions for their parachute jumps into behind enemy lines in France. That was my father with some of his airfields. As a proud Army brat, I have lived in my home, these blue circles are where I've lived, Tarpon Springs, Florida, my hometown, Fort Worden, Washington, across Puget Sound from Seattle, San Francisco, California, at the Presidio, San Francisco, Okinawa, Japan, Tokyo, Japan, Fort Bell, Virginia. I went to 7 schools, 3 of them high schools. Changed addresses about every 2 years. For Army assignments, Fort Benning, Georgia, numerous times, Germany twice, Fort Polk, Louisiana, twice to Vietnam, Culver, Indiana, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Omaha, Nebraska, and finally I retired out of Los Alamitos, California, the old Naval Air Station, where I was an active duty advisor of the 40th Infantry Division there, National Guard. Next slide. These are my very early brat days. After my dad returned from England, he was assigned to Fort Worden, Washington, like I said, across Puget Sound from Seattle. Fort Worden was one of 3 Army bases built, one at Whidbey Island, one at Port Townsend, one other, I forgot where, that had disappearing guns built in 1895 called the Ring of Fire to protect Puget Sound from any potential invasion. When we were there, of course, the guns were gone, but the gun emplacements were there. And if any of you ever saw the movie Officer and a Gentleman, they took a Navy airplane, put it on the parade ground here, and called that a Navy training base. And in several scenes of the movie, my house is shown in the background across the parade ground. But my father commanded the last amphibious engineer regiment in the United States Army. The Seahorse was their unit patch. Instead of a lot of jeeps and trucks, he had seagoing oilers, merchant ships, tugs, and a lot of landing craft of every shape and size, ducks, weasels, you name it, LCMs, LCUs. And he took that entire regiment to Eniwetok to set up for the first atomic bomb test in Eniwetok, 1947-48. By the way, Port Townsend is now a state park. If anybody cares to wish, I went back and rented the house I used to live in. And this picture of me, this is me on top of the car in my hometown, my younger brother on the hood, Dudley, and my older brother in the doorway. We'll see more of them later. Next slide, please. My father's next assignment was the Presidio, San Francisco. Because he had been working with the atomic bombs, he had a Q clearance, and they wouldn't let anybody with that type of clearance anywhere near Korea. It was during the Korean War, so the unit went to Korea, but he didn't. They had a new commander. He became the 6th Army engineer, also the Presidio engineer, and responsible for all the military installations on both sides of the Golden Gate Bridge at the time. This is my father, my younger brother Dudley, myself, my older brother Ernest, who is now in college, University of Florida, taking ROTC, and of course my mother. It's now the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. You can go up there and rent quarters for anybody that wants to. I think the commanding general's quarters start at $17,000 a month. It's now also home to the Disney Family Museum. If you get a chance, I recommend it because you're in the land of Disney down here. It starts from the day Disney was born to the day he died and how he did all the magic in between. And by sheer coincidence, the curator of that museum is the daughter of my best friend from high school in Okinawa. Next slide. This picture was taken on Okinawa in 1952, I guess 53 or 54. That's me now, a little older, my father, who is now the RICOM engineer and also the G4, the guy in charge of logistics for the island. This is my younger brother Dudley and my older brother Ernest, who is now a 2nd lieutenant in the Corps of Engineers, and by sheer coincidence got assigned to a combat engineer company on the island of Okinawa, and one of his assignments was to build the first road around the top end of the island, and they kept telling him, watch out, there may be still Japanese hiding up out there, because this was the early 50s. This is my dad's license plate, the number 13, 1955. Due to his rank, he was entitled probably to number 4. But nobody wanted 13 because of the connotation of bad luck, so he said, I'll take it. I still have that plate. And this is the RICOM patch. It's the Torii, or the Oriental Gate. Next slide, please. This is Kubasaki High School. It was in Quonset huts. Our mascot was a dragon, so it was known as the home of the dragons. And I guess last month I took my wife down to San Diego for a Kubasaki High School reunion. And instead of doing by one class puts it on, but they asked, it includes decades. Turns out I was the oldest classmate down there, and they asked me to get up and get a little talk about what it was like in the olden days. But I was also a member of the Boy Scouts of America, Troop 1. And our patch showed the Oriental Gate, and this is the Far East Council, Japan, Okinawa, Taiwan, and I was proud to be in the Order of the Arrow. I noticed the scouts in here. Next slide, please. After I went to University of Florida through ROTC, I graduated and wound up at Fort Benning, Georgia. I think it's now been retitled Fort Moore, after the famous General Moore from, what was it, I can't remember, the Asheville Valley. But anyway, this is parachute training. These are the 34-foot towers where you learn how to jump out of airplanes. And I've been asked all the time, why do you want to jump out of a perfectly good airplane? And the answer, I can make $56 a month doing it. But anyway, this was the training here. It lasted 3 to 4 weeks, depending on whether you were an officer for 3 weeks or 4 weeks for the enlisted. And I think there's some other paratroopers in the audience. Next slide, please. Next, I was privileged to go to Army Ranger School, which lasts 9 weeks. 3 weeks at Fort Benning, Georgia, learn how to patrol. 3 weeks in the mountains of Dahlonega, Georgia, where you did patrolling in the mountains at night, and you also learned how to rappel and do mountain climbing, things of that nature. You notice this guy here, you probably can't tell, but he's going down the mountain carrying a pretend wounded guy on his back. We did amphibious training, then we had 3 weeks to Florida to do amphibious training and go through the yellow swamp with water up to our eyes where you can't see anything except the guy in front of you with a little glowing tab in the back of his hat. Next slide, please. Then I went to Germany. My first assignment in 1963. I was in an armored division, but a mechanized infantry battalion in an armored division. I went back again in the late 70s to early 80s, and I was in 3rd Infantry Division, also in a mechanized infantry battalion. But this is typical, a cold day in Germany on the Czechoslovakia border. Our mission was, in case of an alert, was to get in all our vehicles and move out fast to the Czechoslovakian border to stop any potential invasion across that border. This assigned attention 50 meters to border, and we had monthly alerts where you get 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, you get a call, you have 2 hours to move, get into the caserne, get all your troops up, get them out to your armored personnel carriers, load all your ammunition, your grenades, your mines, everything else, and move out smartly to an alert area, and then either if you go forward to the border or they call it off, it says it was a successful exercise. They did that once a month. Next slide, please. And as a young lieutenant, I was a company commander because most of the people a lot of them were headed for Korea at that time. And so I had the privilege of being a young lieutenant company commander with 250 people working for me, plus I don't know how many $1 million worth of equipment, but it was quite an experience. This is a picture of an M60 tank at the training area, Grafenwehr, where we cross-trained with tank units in our training. Next slide, please. Now let's go to Vietnam and the main topic. Some background on the Vietnam War and what was the Southeast Asia Collective Defense Treaty, or Manila Pact, 1954 to 77, which I find that most civilians and many in the military have no familiarity with. Next slide, please. And to get more information, I recommend this book to you. It's called Hell in a Very Small Place by Dr. Bernard Fall, who passed away shortly after the book came out. And he talks about the siege and fall at Dien Bien Phu, which was manned by the French when Vietnam was a French colony. And in 1904, Vietnam, as I say, was a French colony, and the battle at Dien Bien Phu ensued with the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh. A Vietnamese communist guerrilla force. The general portion of this was by by Vo Nguyen Giap, destroyed the French force at Dien Bien Phu. They gave up, and the French were kicked out of Vietnam. And they established a demilitarized zone at the 17th parallel. And Dr. Fall suggests in his book that Dien Bien Phu helped convince the North Vietnamese that similar tactics would work against the U.S. military in Vietnam. Next slide, please. So this resulted in the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization in 1954, or SEATO, which some of you in here may remember. The purpose was collective defense, primarily created to block the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. Members, United States, France, Great Britain, New Zealand, Australia, Philippines, Thailand, and Pakistan. It maintained the divide between Communist North and South Vietnam at the 17th parallel, the militarized zone. Next slide. This is a Safe Conduct Pass vintage 1968 signed by President Tu at the time. This is one of a variety of passes that came out depending on who the president was. It's really a pass that we threw billions and billions of them all over South Vietnam for them to chew hoi or give up and come join us, and we will pay you for your weapons and feed you and teach you a new skill, how to be a productive citizen in South Vietnam. The reason I'm showing this, though, because, again, most civilians and a lot of military still think that only the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese and the U.S. were the only people fighting in Vietnam against the North Vietnamese and the VC. However, there are flags on here for other countries that had troops there, Australia, Thailand, South Korea, New Zealand, and the Philippines also provided troops and fought valiantly in South Vietnam. Next slide, please. More background. What was the Tet Offensive? Next slide. The Tet Offensive commenced on January 31st, 1968. The name comes from the Tet holiday, or the Tet Lunar New Year, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. One of the largest military campaigns of the Vietnam War, launched simultaneously by both the VC and the North Vietnamese Army. Surprise attack. Countrywide attacks against the civilians, 44 capitals and 100 cities, also against the forces of South Vietnam, the United States, and the allies that were involved. Next slide, please. I took this picture in Saigon on January 30th, 1968. Everybody getting ready for Tet, because in the past years, Tet was recognized by both the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese as a holiday, and there was unspoken truce between them. So nobody was expecting anything. And then around midnight, all heck broke loose. I took this picture the next morning. The streets are bare. You can see smoke coming out of here, which I think was coming from the U.S. Embassy at the time, because the embassy got overrun for a couple hours by the Viet Cong. Next slide. Now, more about the Khe Sanh. Khe Sanh Combat Base is part of the Tet Offensive. The largest, bloodiest, and most famous battle of the Vietnam War was also underway, which actually started on 21 January. Khe Sanh Combat Base was an obscure Navy outpost in northwest corner of South Vietnam. It's manned by 5,000 plus Marines, plus ARVN battalion of ARVN Rangers. It remained surrounded and under siege by 20,000 North Vietnamese regulars for 77 days. And Khe Sanh became a household word. Next slide, please. Life magazine. Next slide. It's Khe Sanh, it's where the action is, the newspaper. Next slide. 1,100 red shells hit Khe Sanh in a good day. Next slide, please. Strategic importance of Khe Sanh. Why was all this going on? The combat base was located astride Route 9, which is a main infiltration base for the North Vietnamese into the northern part of South Vietnam, to a lot of military installations in that northern part of South Vietnam, particularly the Marine Corps area. During the Tet Offensive, the base had tactical, strategic, and psychological importance to both the U.S. and the North Vietnamese Army. The NVA general who led the attack was General Vo Nguyen Giap, the same general who defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, which you can see some of the psychological importance for the North Vietnamese to capture or destroy Khe Sanh. Next slide, please. It got so important, it got President Johnson's attention. He had a terrain model constructed. He kept it in the base of the White House, consulted it, and gave orders accordingly of what he thought in some cases we should be doing. However, that model is now in the Johnson Library, and I think it's in Austin, Texas. Next slide. Where is Khe Sanh? Next slide. Map of South Vietnam, 1968. This is South Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and here's major cities: Saigon, Nha Trang, you have Da Nang, Hue, and way up here, you can barely see it, is Khe Sanh. And this says I Corps, 2 Corps, 3 Corps, and 4 Corps. Basically, corps are Army military designations. Generally, there's a 3-star general in charge of a corps area. And so I Corps was all Marine Corps. The rest, the Army, was down in here. Next slide, please. This is the blow-up of the northern part. This is North Vietnam, Laos, the demilitarized zone, and this is Route 9, and this is Dr. Bernard's Fall, Highway 1 that he talks about. And then it's hard to see. This is Highway 9, leaving the Khe Sanh area, and then the Long Bay, and the 9 goes into Laos. Long Bay became famous because it was overrun by the North Vietnamese. A friend of mine was the camp commander at the time, and he wound up having a Russian PT-76 tank sitting on top of his bunker. But they managed to get out eventually. Next slide. This is an aerial view of the Khe Sanh Combat Base. This is a aluminum runway which could handle C-123s and C-130s. This is the perimeter of the base here. The ARVN Rangers were down here, and then the Marines were here. And this is my location, Forward Operating Base 1, which is Special Forces or Green Berets, if that's more familiar with you, in the upper left-hand corner. The main road into Quezon from Route 9 came along us and into the Quezon Combat Base. Next slide, please. Now, pictures of my ride up to Quezon. And they said, when you get in a helicopter, now as soon as you get there, the helicopter's not going to land. You just hop off and find a place to duck. I said, what are they talking about? Well, anyway, so that's one of the two helicopters. The other one was accompanying us. Next slide. This is Route 9, headed towards Laos. We were following it. Next slide. This shows as we went along, these are the jungle denuded on these hills from B-52 strikes. B-52s were a very mighty weapon. In fact, I'm here today, as I'll show you later, because of B-52s. In fact, Quezon survived because of B-52s of these bomb strikes. Next slide. This is coming into the northeast corner quadrant of Quezon Combat Base. You can see the runway, you can see the perimeter, and all the barbed wire and all these sandbags and bunkers have claymore mines out in front of them, anti-tank mines, and everything else. And this is some of the ARVN Ranger area and starting in the Marine area too. I took some of these slides later on after the siege was lifted so you can see more greenery than it was there when I was there at the first. Next slide. Further on into the middle section of Quezon, the runway goes on to the offload area here. And this is where the headquarters, so Colonel Lowndes, Marine Corps, was in charge of the 26th Marine Regiment. They had underground bunkers, which originally belonged to Special Forces, but the Marines took them over from us. That's why we moved to the outer perimeter. But more trenches and barbed wires, and the NVA were digging trenches trying to get in under our wires and minefields and stuff. Next slide, please. Now, further over, this is the road I mentioned going into the Quezon Combat Base, and this was Forward Operating Base 3. And you notice the Marines didn't particularly trust us, so they had their own wire, and then we had our wire. And one reason, because we had 300 Montagnards, local natives, working for us, and they really didn't trust anybody that wasn't American or were white, so to speak. So we had our own compound there. Next slide, please. And took this after the siege, of course, but this is that main road into Quezon. You can see North Vietnamese Army trenches that were being dug to get into Quezon, and these are B-52 strikes, deep, wide craters. This is typical all over that area from the Arclight missions. Next slide, please. Now, looking at Quezon Combat Base as we're landing, this is barbed wire. It's hard to see, but behind every sandbag is a claymore mine. And also, when we found out what happened to Langvay with the Russian tanks down there, with the NVA manning them, we put out anti-tank mines also, all around the perimeter. And these are communication trenches and ways to get around. And these are some of our Montagnard mercenaries that work for us standing on their bunkers. Next slide. This is more bunkers along that road I mentioned going into Quezon, some more people standing on their bunkers. However, these are artillery impacts from the guns in Korak, and I'll talk about Korak Mountain in Laos in a minute. Next slide, please. More of our trenches. You see more of the Montagnards that are mercenary soldiers, very loyal, very good young soldiers. Next slide, please. This is the command bunker. I was lucky I was down inside the command bunker, my job at the time. And we burned everything. We talk about Afghanistan and the burn pits. Well, we didn't have burn pits. We had 55-gallon drums we burned stuff in. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the Marines CH-46s delivering supplies to the main runway when they can get in anyway. Next slide. This was a helicopter that was shot down and crash landed in our wire. A lot of that was going on. Next slide. Now, I mentioned Korak Mountain. This is Laos over here, and this is Korak Mountain, which is full of limestone caves. The Japanese used them in World War II. The Viet Minh used them against the French, and then the NVA used them and kept hollowing them out, making them more livable. And if you ever saw the movie Guns of Navarone with Gregory Peck, where they had these huge cannon. And I think they were in Greece. They had used the cannon. They wanted to sink British ships going through the Mediterranean as they passed Greece. Well, what the North Vietnamese did, they had these caves. They made cutouts in them, stuck in their heavy artillery, and fired at us at will because we couldn't have anything at Quai Son that could reach it. And they were so far down on the mountain, the planes, the fighter planes couldn't reach them either. So they fired at will, and anytime they felt they could get away with it. Next slide, please. And this is an example. Every morning at this time period, there was heavy fog in the area. And we knew people were outside the wire. This is some of our barbed wire. You can see an anti-tank mine there and the sandbags with the claymores. Where the fog would lift, and we find the families of our Brew Mountain Yard out there because they lived in local villages. And they would be in there, be unharassed. They'd be directed to come to our wire because they knew we'd let them in. Next slide, please. Then we put them in the trenches and then wait for the big helicopters, the Chinooks, to come in to take them to an area further east where they could have better living conditions than with all the artillery. Well, as soon as those helicopters came in, we had to load them onto the helicopters. Those guns at Coal Rock would open up trying to knock out those helicopters. Next slide, please. These are just some general pictures of the activity. This is the NVA rocket strike on the Marine Corps ammo dump. Next slide. The nighttime hit. Next slide. Hit a fuel dump. Next slide, please. This is a rocket attack, the fuel dump, then they hit the runway. Next slide. If they fire, we go in anyway. The airfield was under attack so much, it became harder and harder for aircraft to land without taking casualties or anything. But the motto of the Air Force for a long time, if they fire, we go in anyway. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to show you a movie that's put together there was an Air Force major talking, but he's talking 2 years after the invasion took place, because after the Quai Son combat base was closed, they opened it again for some operations. They didn't make it a big base, but they used the runway for further operations. But he's talking about what happened in 1968. You got it? No, back. You need to go back.
Well, we're back here in Quai Son. I was here about 3 years ago, about this time. The time we were running 130. Well, we're back here in Quai Son. I was here about 3 years ago, about this time. The time we were running 130 to support of the Marines. Well, we're back here in Quai Son. I was here about 3 years ago, about this time. The time we were running 130 to support of the Marines. And each and every day for a period, I guess, over 80 days, the C-130 lift was a lifeline to Quai Son. They said it was a victory through air power, but for us grunts on the ground, it was really a victory for the 130 capability to deliver here. We had TAC air in support, and these ridge lines in here, we had fighter jocks supporting, and I guess B-52 strikes were running right up to the perimeter. But there were days when there was no TAC close air support, and the 130s continued air land. They'd land up in this area, and they'd take fire from the hills surrounding it coming in. They'd be under fire almost constantly, and then when they landed, the NVA and the hills would start flipping a few in on them. So we got the name of calling them mortar bait all the time. Their ground times then used to extend sometimes up to about 1 minute. You'd have 60 GIs run on to get out. Sometimes we keep a little longer for medevac. container delivery system. Just off this horizon here, we set up a drop zone of about 300 by 300 yards. Very tight, small drop zone. They use a CDS drop. About 600 feet, successfully put in about 150 to 200 tons a day. We couldn't deliver in containers, these one-ton containers, heavy bunker and barrier material, some of which you see around Quezon today. We asked the Air Force what they could do. Started with a LAAT, a low-altitude parachute extraction. They successfully delivered for a number of days just tons and tons of barrier material and supplies. Proximity extraction system, which is an arrested barrier and a hook. Our requirements for beans and bullets were well over 200 to 300 tons a day. We got a hell of a lot of in with choppers, but the heavy tonnage requirement was moved by the old 130s and TAC. It's been my experience with working with the airlifters during the last stint here that they supported us in the Delta, back into the Ashaw Valley with the first team in Al Louis. They've lost airplanes every...
This picture of a C-123 and a C-130 that was shot down at Quezon. The NVA were close enough they could fire 50 caliber machine guns from the end of the runways, so it got very dangerous for those pilots and the aircraft at the same time. Next slide, please. This is a C-130. It was shot down, caught fire. I had one of our lieutenants on it with a payroll for a Montyard. And he was so shook up, he came back to FOB-3, where's the payroll? Oh, I forgot. He went back and it hadn't been burned up yet. He got it, so we were able to pay a Montyard. Next slide. By the way, the Montyard had nowhere to spend it, so all they did with the money was gamble. And then you saw in the picture of the airdrop. That's because they stopped doing those parachute extractions of cargo out of it. And so it was beans and bullets. That's all supposedly was allowed on it. But we had some friends back in Da Nang. They said they were going to give us a treat. So they set up a pallet, and in the middle of the pallet they put Cokes, booze, and some goodies, and put sea rations all around it. Unfortunately, the chute didn't open. And so my boss had to go report to Colonel Lowndes and explain why his guys were getting beans and bullets and we were getting sodas and food. Next slide, please. This is just a fighter bomb strike. The close end. Next slide. This, I mentioned the B-52. This is an Arclight B-52. They were called Arclight Mission, code name, and they carried 51 500-ton bombs. Next slide. Now this is a B-52 strike, one airplane, and the whole jungle boils.
It's now approximately 0725 hours on the morning of the 20th of March, 1968. We have a patrol out all night. It's approximately 1,000 meters in front of the lines. The enemy has them pinned down right now. They're unable to break contact. We have an O-2B aircraft flying overhead who's going to pretty soon bring in a bunch of jet aircraft which are stacked overhead. He's got about 5 or 6 planes up there, and we hope to extract the patrol during the confusion caused by the bombing, which will commence in a little bit. Listen close now. You can hear the plane circling overhead of the area. That noise in the background was
What that noise was, and it's a complete surprise to me when I was making that recording, was a one B-52 dropping its bomb. And part of the tape is not as good anymore, but it's got really low. First time I heard that was 3 o'clock one morning. I had no idea what it was, and I thought if the NVA used that against us, we'd go well. But it was us, thank goodness. Talk a little bit about the relief of Quezon, Operation Pegasus. On March the 30th, 1968, command of control of Quezon Combat Base was turned over from the 26th Marine Regiment to the 1st Cavalry Division in Mobile. They're the guys with all the helicopters. And the 1st Cavalry Division initiated Operation Pegasus for the relief of Quezon. It was accomplished by 8 April 1968. And the combat base remained operational as the Marines destroyed bunkers and equipment before closing the base in July 1968. Any questions what I just said? No, okay. Next slide, please. I get carried away. Let's look at a little box score of the 77-day of the siege. And it really depends on the source. You go to different sources, you find different figures. I don't know if anybody really ever kept correct score or not. But killed in action, U.S., 407 at Quezon. Wounded in action, over 2,000. However, NVA, we estimate over 10,000 plus were killed, mostly by the B-52s. Incoming artillery, rocket rounds, 11,714. I would swear there were a lot more than that. Outgoing artillery rounds, over 117,000. So they really kept those airplane loads coming in with the artillery. Averaged 1,800 tons of bombs on the enemy every day from the B-52s. Results, 2 enemy divisions. That's 20,000 plus NVA soldiers were decimated and tied down during the Tet Offensive. They couldn't get into Route 9. They didn't want to go south. They wanted to destroy us. So they didn't support the Tet Offensive and other places in South Vietnam. As mentioned earlier, it was awarded the Navy Presidential Unit Citation in May 1968. By the way, the operations officer was a Marine Carl Mundy Jr., who became the Commandant of the Marine Corps many years later as a 4-star general. Next slide. Now talk a little bit about what I was doing there. Now I wasn't a Marine, Army. My Special Forces unit, Quezon at FOB-3, was a subunit of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observation Group, or MACV-SOG or MAC-SOG. If you take the words studies and observation and replace them with special operations, you'll get a better feel for what we did. It was a top secret cross-border operations, and we had to sign an oath that we couldn't talk anything about it for 30 years or we go to jail. However, it came out earlier because somebody talked about it, and it started, Soldier of Fortune started publishing Penetrate Secrecy Surrounding Special. So people started talking about it. If anybody's interested, there's all kind of stuff in YouTube about it. But it was consisted of Army Special Forces or Green Berets, Navy SEALs, Air Commandos, Marine Corps Recon, and the CIA. And was a SOG launch site for reconnaissance operation and Laos and occasionally North Vietnam. Next slide. I won't go into the operations. Like I said, there's a lot on YouTube. But talk about some of the more interesting aspects I thought were interesting in my things I dealt with. Those that have watched James Bond movie, you remember the guy Q. He was their guy, the inventor, invented all kind of fancy stuff for James Bond. Well, we had a Q that worked in the Special Operations, the 1st Special Forces Group on Okinawa. and he came up with all kind of stuff. And there was a company that came out with a gyrojet rocket pistol, and he sent a bunch to us at Caisson to try them out, see what they were like. And the difference between a rocket pistol and a regular pistol is that rockets gain velocity as it goes out the barrel, where a pistol bullet loses velocity. So this looks great, man. We ought to try it. So we were issued those. We went out and said, nah, I don't want to try them out against the NVA. We got a 5-gallon can of water, put it out, stood back where you would shoot a 45, and shot it, and the rockets hadn't gained enough velocity to penetrate the 5-gallon can full of water. So this is not good. And anytime you try to hit something at a distance, you'd miss it. So we went back to our 45s. However, I was with my wife many years ago touring the U.S. Mint in Carson City. They have a weapons museum there, and it's the one and only time in the United States I've ever seen one on display. I wish I'd have kept mine. It'd be worth a fortune today. Next slide, please. This is an interesting thing, and I think some of it is still going on today. The code name when I was there was Eldest Son. They've had other code names for it. But it's a top secret gray propaganda operation. There's black, gray, and white propaganda. It kind of fell in the middle. You're not quite sure where the information's coming from. But it was how the intent was to make the NVA and the VC suspicious of their weapons and ammunition, not trust them, because they were supplied by China, Czechoslovakia, Russia, not necessarily China. I mean, the North Vietnamese didn't make their own weapons. And the thought was this guy in Okinawa came up with the idea to substitute doctored ammunition in their supply system. So our job was to go out and raid enemy ammunition dumps, or best way we can, to find unopened, crated enemy ammunition, the small arms ammunition and mortar rounds. And then get them over to Okinawa, where they'd very carefully open these crates, take out the ammunition, unsolder cans very carefully, take out 1 or 2 rounds, use a puller, inertia puller on the head, pull the head out of the bullet, dump the powder, and put high explosive in the shell. Very carefully put the head back on the bullets, put them back into the case, resolder it, reseal it, just like it was never opened. Did the same thing with mortar rounds. Mortars, they're fired from little shotgun shells, like shells. They had emptied them and put high explosive in those shells, then seal them back into the mortar crates. And then our job was to insert them back into enemy ammunition dumps or somewhere they could be found along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Well, what result was that when other units started fighting these people, they'd find dead NVA and VC with their weapons, blown up weapons beside them. What's this? No idea. The U.S., because it was top secret. Nobody knew about it but us. And so they would send them back to Saigon to a technical analysis. They said, my gosh, something's blown up these weapons. What it is, they put out a big thing and they tell American troops, don't fire any enemy ammunition. Make sure you don't do anything, because guys were using captured AK-47s and other Russian equipment. And so they tell them not to do it. And then we would make sure somehow that these pamphlets fell into enemy hands, that they would know that they're being analyzed and found out the ammunition was suspect, to hopefully maybe to scare the NVA or the VC not use their weapons. Whether it was successful or not, I don't know, but it was a good idea by our Q in Okinawa. Next slide, please. These are some of I took this thing, FOB 3 in 1968. These are some of the guys almost ready to go out on patrol after the siege was lifted. Next slide. These are Cambodian border bandits. We hired them also in addition to our local mercenaries, the Brew Montagnards. But it turned out they can make more money working for us than they could robbing people on the border. So they would come and do that. Next slide, please. This is a picture of me in my leaner, meaner days. Next slide. This is now, once the siege is lifted, we're getting ready to go back into operation into Laos. This is one of our strike team leaders. Generally, we had 2 Americans go out with about 5 or 6 Brew Montagnards. This young man here is 14. Look at all the grenades that he's got on him. And they were so small, that sometimes they had trouble throwing a grenade far enough that they wouldn't pick up shrapnel on their own. But they were, as I said early, very loyal and dedicated. And one of the sore spots with Special Forces is when we left Vietnam, we left all these Montagnards to fend on their own. And they were the Hill tribe peoples. Next slide, please. Now, this is a couple of Hueys getting ready to insert. And this is a Cobra gunship. Next slide. Here's another picture of the Cobra. We were some of the first, when Cobra first wound up in Vietnam, we were one of the first groups to get support with the Cobra gunship. Next slide. This is CH-34, first used by the Marines in the early days of Vietnam. However, all our pilots were Vietnamese, very brave. We found out a lot of them would take us into places that other military, U.S. military pilots refused to go. But they're very brave and loyal, and a lot of rescues in very desperate situations for our people. Next slide, please. SOG clandestine operations. This is kind of a wrap-up of that portion. Lost killed in action, Green Berets, 243. 10 teams missing in action, got killed, or we don't know what happened. 14 teams overrun, wounded in action over 90%. Lost killed in action, indigenous, the Montagnards, etc., many. Results, significant intelligence required. We rescued downed pilots, destroyed large amounts of enemy material because we go in, identify these things, and ask for B-52 strikes on them. And then thousands of NVA troops diverted to rear air security trying to track these small groups down. And then the SOG, MACV-SOG received the Army Presidential Unit citation in April 2001. Next slide, please. I threw this in. It says the Vietnam's War Most Covert Agency, MACV-SOG. And this is, I guess, from 2020 magazine article. I cut it out. Next slide. And so there were pretty days at Quezon. It was on an old rubber plantation, a Mitchell rubber plantation. Next slide. A little bit of after I retired from the Army in 1984, after a 20-year career with McDonnell Douglas and Boeing military applications. I was a member of the C-17 design team, for those that are familiar with Air Force airplanes. And also I was one of the management leads to replace the C-130 with a thing called the Advanced Theater Transport. That never happened, unfortunately. Some of our partners made their own versions in Europe. The Air Force didn't have jets, so the Air Force said they didn't want it. The Army loved it, wanted it, but that didn't happen. Next slide. This is my family. My father, my older brother, when he was in the 75th Infantry Regiment, Corps of Engineers in Okinawa. That's me, of course. And this is my younger brother who commanded an Honest John atomic rocket battery in Germany around 1964. Next slide, please. I'm very proud of my two sons. This is my oldest son, Lieutenant Colonel, retired, Air Force retired, Air Force Academy class of '89. This is my youngest son, Robert West Point, class of '92, PhD Pepperdine. He's the Vice President of Pacific Life Insurance Company down at close by. Next slide, please. Some reflections on military service. As the old veterans in here know, freedom is not free. Army service is my choice, and I'd serve again. And unparalleled paid adventures, wherever you're going to go. And military families also serve, but they don't get the same recognition. So if any families in here, the veterans, thank you for your service too. And lessons learned, you can see them. And again, we put this together for the high school students: leadership, commitment, assuming responsibility, self-discipline, etc. Next slide, please. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'm willing to take some or you can talk to me afterwards. Well, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Major Sally. That was incredible. Let's have another round of applause for Major Sally. We are so fortunate that you and your wife Linda have afforded us the opportunity to hear your story here today on Veterans Day here in Laguna Niguel. I'm Councilmember Ray Genoway, and here in Laguna Niguel, we honor our veterans. We honor the flag of the United States, which is the greatest symbol of hope and freedom across the world. And when our veterans, when our members of the armed services wear that flag, they personify that hope and freedom wherever they go. As a very special part of our Veterans Day ceremony, the Girl Scouts, Cub Scouts, and Brownies will be delivering handmade thank you cards to all of our veterans that are here with us today. Today's handmade thank you cards were created by the following troops: Girl Scout Troops 8597 and 6479, Brownie Girl Scout Troop 1487, and Cub Scout Pack number 700. To all our veterans in attendance, when your name is called, please stand to be recognized if you are able to. If you are unable, please raise your hand, and one of our brownies will deliver your special thank you card to your seat. And when I do call your name, please rise if you're able. Tim Bowman, Chief Warrant Officer 2, 1975 to 1997, United States Army. Hammond Sally, Major, 1963 to 1984, United States Army. David Tuma, Airman, First Class, 1980 to 1984, United States Air Force. John Ulrich, Staff Sergeant, 1966 to 1970, United States Air Force. Shep Bentley, Lieutenant Colonel, 1980 to 2005, United States Marine Corps. John Humphrey, 17 years in the United States Army. Al Suhada, Specialist 5, Army and Technical Sergeant, 1969 to 1971 and 1981 and 2001, United States Army and United States Air Force. Charles Axon, Lieutenant, 1967, United States Navy. Dan Grodzinski, Specialist E5, 1960 to 1966, United States Army. Jim Van Schack, Sergeant, 1946 to 1948, United States Army. Bill Lieber, Sergeant, 1973 to 1976, United States Army. John P. Stodd, Lieutenant Colonel, 1942 to 1962, United States Marine Corps. John E. Barnett, Colonel, 1942 to 1962, United States Marine Corps. George Swank, Major, 1981 to 2006, United States Army. Frank McGrath, Lieutenant, 1970 to 1976, United States Navy. Gary Schwartz, Specialist 5, 1966 to 1968, United States Army. John Schutz, Captain, 1967 to 1969, United States Air Force. Paul Steffen, G6, 1996 to 2016, United States Navy. Lucky Walsh, E3 Quartermaster, 1959 to 1965, United States Navy. Chris Skura, Corporal, 2005, Air Force. Alex Santo, Sergeant, 2011 and 2019, United States Army. Scott Williams, First Lieutenant, 1966 to 1969, United States Army. Gerald Bosley, 2012 to 2023, United States Army. Ralph Bolter, Sergeant, 1977 to 1981, United States Marine Corps. Tim Vasky, E3, 2008 to 2012, United States Air Force. Philip Parks, Private, E2, 1992, United States Army. Michael S. Jameson, Staff Sergeant, 1968 to 1970, Army Special Forces. And for those who could not be with us here today, we honor their memory. Richard Deneen Forney, Sergeant, 1950 to 1952, U.S. Army. George F. Jurowski, Lieutenant Colonel, 1956 to 1978, United States Air Force. George Bill Sedgwick, Staff Sergeant, 1967 to 1971, United States Air Force. Earl Briner, Army Air Corps. Dennis Mulvaney, United States Army. Jerry McCloskey, United States Navy. And Vito Ferlato, United States Air Force. To all our veterans out there today, here in our community, throughout our state and across our country, and around our globe, we sincerely thank you for your service and your sacrifice and your dedication to our country, to hope and freedom across the world. We owe you a debt of gratitude. We owe your families a debt of gratitude. And we will always honor you here in the great city of Laguna Niguel. As we conclude today's program, I would like to thank all of those who have graciously contributed to making this Veterans Day ceremony possible. Veteran Major Hammond Sally. Orange County Sheriff's Deputy Joe DeVella. And let me tell you, Deputy DeVella is not just an amazing singer, he is an excellent deputy sheriff. When I was assigned as a prosecutor at the juvenile court, he was the bailiff in the courtroom where I worked, and it's such an honor to cross paths with Deputy DeVella again here in Laguna Niguel. We'd also like to thank the Boy Scouts, the Cub Scout packs, the Girl Scouts, and the Brownie troops who have written the cards and participated in the ceremony. We'd like to thank all members of the Laguna Niguel City Council here in attendance. Our Assistant City Manager, Justin Martin. Our wonderful Laguna Niguel Parks and Recreation Department. The Laguna Niguel Military Support Committee. The Laguna Niguel Women's Club. American Legion Post 281, American Legion Auxiliary 281, the Freedom Committee of Orange County. And thank all of you for joining us here today. Please join us in the courtyard to enjoy fresh refreshments and conversation. May God bless you, and may God continue to bless the United States of America.